She buried her husband with nothing but a prayer and a lie. 16 years later, men with guns came to collect what he'd left behind. And the only thing standing between Eleanor Grayson and a shallow grave in the snow was a 27-year-old trapper who had no business loving her, and every reason to. If you've ever been told your best days are behind you, stay with me. Because this story is about a woman who proved that surviving isn't the same as living, and that the fiercest battles aren't fought with rifles. They're fought inside the chest, in the quiet hours before dawn, when you have to decide who you still want to be. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's begin. The first snow of November came early to the Blackstone Mountains, the kind that arrived without warning and stayed without mercy. By the third week, the pass road had disappeared under 4 feet of white silence, and Eleanor Grayson had not spoken a single word aloud in 11 days. She'd counted. Not because she was lonely, exactly. Eleanor had long since made her peace with quiet. But there was a difference between choosing silence and having it handed to you like a sentence, and lately the two had started to feel the same. She was 43 years old. Her hands were rough from splitting wood and hauling water and patching fences that the wind tore open again before the mud could dry. Her dark hair had gone silver at the temples sometime in the last 2 years. She wasn't sure exactly when, because she'd stopped looking in mirrors around the time she stopped expecting anything good to walk through her door. The trading post she ran sat at the edge of civilization, which was a generous way of saying it sat at the edge of nothing. 3 rooms built from mountain pine that had warped in the cold until the doors wouldn't close flush. A front room with a counter and shelves of dry goods, lamp oil, rope, tobacco, and a dozen other things that kept the sparse population of trappers and ranchers alive through winter. A back room that served as her kitchen, bedroom, and sitting room all at once. And a storage cellar beneath the floorboards that smelled of earth and old iron and something she'd never quite been able to name. Her husband, Thomas Grayson, had built it 20 years ago with money he claimed came from honest merchant work. Eleanor had believed him because she was young, and because he was handsome in that particular way that makes young women accept explanations they know are thin. Thomas had been dead for 8 years. The trading post was hers now, technically. In practice, it belonged to the First Territorial Bank of Harrow, which held a lien against the property that Eleanor had been chipping away at with the slowness of water wearing down stone. Some months she made enough to cover the interest and a little extra. Some months she didn't, and she'd go to bed calculating what she could sell and what she couldn't live without, and often the numbers didn't add up no matter how she arranged them. Her nearest neighbor, a rancher named Dodd, who ran cattle 3 miles south, had offered to buy her out 6 times in as many years. Each offer came with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a comment tucked inside it like a blade inside a handshake. "A woman alone up here, at your age. It's no kind of life, Eleanor. You ought to think about what's practical." She always sent him home with the same answer: the land wasn't for sale. What she didn't say was that the land was all she had left of anything. Not because she loved it, exactly, but because selling it would mean admitting that the life she'd built here, the cold mornings, the debt, the silence, had been for nothing. And she wasn't ready to admit that. Not yet. The afternoon Silas Rowan first walked through her door, Eleanor was behind the counter tallying a column of figures that kept refusing to come out right. She heard the creak of the front steps under boot weight and looked up expecting Dodd, or possibly the supply rider from Harrow who came every 2 weeks and always smelled like he'd been drinking since morning. The man who ducked through her low doorway was neither. He was young. She clocked that immediately, the way you clock the weather. Late 20s, maybe. Tall enough that the doorframe caught the back of his hat brim, and he had to tilt his head on the way in. He wore a canvas coat that had been patched in 3 places, trail-worn boots, and he carried a rifle slung across his back with the ease of someone who'd been doing it so long he'd forgotten it was there. His face was lean and weathered beyond his years, the way men got when they spent most of their lives outdoors. A few days of dark beard, eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that Eleanor would later find difficult to describe accurately, not because she couldn't find the words, but because she noticed them at all, which surprised her. He looked around the store with the unhurried assessment of someone accustomed to reading new spaces quickly. Then he walked to the counter and set down a small canvas sack that clinked with coin. "I need lamp oil, salt, dried beans if you have them, and whatever you charge for a spare wool blanket," he said. His voice was quieter than she expected. "And I'll pay a fair price. I'm not looking to bargain." Eleanor studied him for a moment. "I don't bargain," she said. "The prices are what they are." "Good." He met her eyes without any of the particular quality that men sometimes brought into her store. The slight condescension, the casual assumption that a woman running a place like this must be either desperate or foolish, or both. He just looked at her directly, like she was simply a person standing behind a counter. It was, she reflected later, more disarming than it had any right to be. She filled his order. He paid without complaint, loaded the items into his pack with practiced efficiency, and was nearly at the door when he stopped. "Your fence rail out back is split clean through," he said, without turning around. "Wind'll take it tonight if you don't brace it. Could take most of the rear section with it." Eleanor set down her pencil. "I know." "You have spare timber?" "I have what I have." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned around, and there was no particular expression on his face, just a kind of thoughtful assessment. "I've got an hour before dark. I can fix it if you want. I don't need charity." "I know you don't." He said it simply, without offense. "I've got rope and timber in my rig that I'm not using tonight. Consider it a trade for the directions to the Henderson Creek Trail. I've been trying to find it for 2 days." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she told him how to find the Henderson Creek Trail. And Silas Rowan went out back and fixed her fence in the dying light, working with the focused competence of someone who didn't need to be told twice how to do anything. He was gone before she thought to ask his name. He came back 4 days later. He bought more supplies. Not more than he needed, she noticed, just what he'd actually run out of. And this time he mentioned that one of her water barrels had a slow leak that would become a faster one if it sat in the freeze-thaw cycle another week. "I noticed it when I was working on the fence," he said. "How do you know it's still leaking?" "I don't. I'm guessing." Eleanor went out and looked. He was right. His name, she learned, was Silas Rowan. He was a trapper by trade, which meant he moved through the Blackstone High Country following a circuit of lines he'd set over several seasons, checking in at the trading post every week or two when his route brought him through. He talked without waste. He didn't fill silences with noise the way some men did, the ones who were uncomfortable unless they could hear themselves speaking. By December, he'd repaired the water barrel, rehung the storage room door that had been sticking since September, and helped her stack 2 cords of wood along the south wall where it would stay driest. He never asked for payment beyond what they'd agreed on, and he never made the work into something larger than it was. Didn't stand back and survey it with the look that said, "You'd have been in real trouble without me." He just did what needed doing and moved on. Eleanor found this so deeply unusual that, for several weeks, she spent time trying to figure out what he actually wanted. Everyone wanted something. Her husband had wanted her silence. Dodd wanted her land. The bank wanted her money. Strangers who did favors were generally working towards something, and the longer it took them to reveal it, the worse it usually turned out to be. But December became January, and January brought cold that dropped the temperature to the point where the sap in the pines cracked like rifle shots in the night. And Silas Rowan kept coming through her door every week or two with nothing on his face but straightforward purpose, and she still couldn't figure out his angle. She started to think, tentatively, against her better judgment, that maybe there wasn't one. It was in the deep of January that he started staying through the worst nights. Not inside. She hadn't offered that, and he hadn't asked. He slept in the barn when the storms came down hard enough that traveling would be dangerous. And in exchange, he kept the animals through the night, checking on the 2 horses and the small flock of goats that Eleanor relied on for milk, and that were prone to a variety of catastrophes in extreme cold. She was aware that she should probably put a stop to it, not because she thought he had bad intentions, but because she could feel herself getting used to it. The sound of someone else moving around the property in the mornings, a lamp burning in the barn window, footsteps on the porch that weren't hers. One evening in late January, she made soup, thick venison broth with root vegetables. And there was more than she needed for one person, which was a fact she had been aware of when she made it. She stood in her kitchen for 10 minutes arguing with herself about it, and then she went to the barn door and knocked. "Soup's on if you want it," she said through the wood. A pause. Then, "I'll be in directly." He sat at her kitchen table and ate 2 bowls of soup without ceremony. and she sat across from him and ate one bowl, and for a while neither of them said anything. Outside, the wind worked at the eaves and the snow ticked against the window glass. "You've been out here a long time," Silas said eventually. Not a question, more like a thing he'd been thinking about that finally made it to his mouth. 14 years, alone the last 8. Since Thomas died. He nodded, looking down at the bowl. "Hard country to be on your own in." "Harder than I expected," Eleanor said, which was probably the most honest thing she'd said to another person in 2 years. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out before she could stop it, and she sat with the discomfort of that for a moment before deciding it didn't need to be taken back. "Why'd you stay?" he asked. "Where would I go?" "That's not an answer." She looked at him across the table, this quiet young man with his worn coat and his careful eyes, and she felt something turn over very slowly in her chest. Not warmth exactly, or not only warmth. Something more complicated. Something she didn't have a name for anymore, because she'd been telling herself for so long that she was past the age of feeling things like this. "The land's mine," she said finally, "or close enough to mine that it amounts to the same thing. I worked for it. I'm not going to hand it over to a bank or a man like Dodd just because it's difficult." Silas nodded slowly. "Good reason." "What about you?" she said, because she'd been wanting to ask for weeks and had kept not asking. "You've been running this circuit since October. Most trappers head south by January." Something shifted slightly in his expression, barely enough to see, but she'd been watching him long enough by then to notice. A kind of careful stillness. "I've got business in the territory," he said. "Trapping business." Among other things, she held his gaze for a moment. He didn't look away, but he didn't elaborate either. And Eleanor, who had learned over a long life that pressing men on things they didn't want to say rarely produced the truth anyway, let it go. After he left that night, she washed the bowls and stood at the window looking out at the dark for a long time. "Stop it," she told herself. She didn't entirely listen. February arrived with a thaw that was brief and treacherous, the kind that turned the trail to mud just long enough to let people think spring was coming, and then slammed back into frozen iron within a week. Silas came through during the thaw, quieter than usual, and Eleanor noticed that he scanned the tree line when he tied his horse out front in a way he hadn't done before. She didn't mention it, but on the third day of the freeze-back, when he came in for coffee, a habit that had developed so gradually she couldn't have said exactly when it started. She put 2 cups on the table and sat down across from him before he could take his coat off. "Tell me what you're actually doing up here," she said. He looked at her. His hands were wrapped around the cup. Outside, the wind had come back, that low, steady howl that in the Blackstone could go on for days. "Trapping," he said. "Silas." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked down at the coffee, then back up. "There's a man," he said. "Been working through this territory for 3 years. He runs a crew, gunmen, hired out for the kind of work that doesn't get written in contracts. About 2 years back, he killed my brother." He said the last sentence without any particular change in his voice, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it hard. "I've been following him north. I know he came through this pass sometime in the fall. I've been running the circuit to try to pick up his trail." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. "And if you find him?" "When I find him." He looked up, and for the first time she saw something behind those gray-green eyes that was neither quiet nor careful. "I'll do what needs doing." She thought about asking more. "What does that mean? What are you planning? Is this going to bring trouble to my door?" And then didn't, because she already knew the answer to the last question, and she didn't want to say it out loud. "His name?" she said instead. "Caleb Voss." The name meant nothing to her then. 3 weeks later, it would mean everything. What? Valentine's Day came and went, which Eleanor only noticed because the supply rider from Harrow brought a letter from the bank, and the date was printed at the top. The letter informed her, in the patient language of institutions that don't need to raise their voice, that her next payment was due in 30 days, and that failure to meet this payment would initiate proceedings. She sat with the letter for a long time, doing the math she already knew the answer to. That evening, Silas found her at the kitchen table with the papers spread in front of her and the lamp turned up high. And he didn't ask what was wrong because the answer was obvious from across the room. "How much?" he said. None of your concern. Eleanor. She looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, hat in his hand, and there was something in his face that made her want to look away, because it was too direct and she hadn't built up defenses against it yet. Enough that I can't cover it and keep the lights on, she said. I'll manage. How? I'll figure it out. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited, which was such an ordinary thing, such a thing that a person did when they knew they were welcome, that it caught in her throat for a second. Let me help, he said. You don't have money to spare. I know what trappers make. I have some saved. No. Eleanor, no. She said it firmly, and she made herself hold his gaze as she said it. I'm not taking your money, Silas. That's not something I'm willing to do. He was quiet for a moment. What this is, he said slowly. She said nothing. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and he was close enough that she could see the particular lines at the corners of his eyes that weather and sun and years of squinting into mountain distances had put there, close enough that she was very aware of the stillness between them. I don't know exactly how to say this, he said carefully, like someone choosing their footing on uncertain ground, in a way that you'll hear without deciding I'm foolish or you need to set me straight. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. Then maybe don't say it. Eleanor. His voice was quiet and completely steady. I think you know I'm not up here just for the trapping. She stood up then. She went to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the dark where the snow caught the lamplight and glowed faint silver. Her arms were crossed, and she was aware that she was holding herself together with some effort. Silas, she said carefully, you're 27 years old. Yes, I'm 43. I know how old you are. Then you understand what I'm telling you. I understand what you think you're telling me, he said. That's not the same thing. She turned around then because she needed him to hear her and she couldn't do it with her back to him. He was still sitting at the table, still watching her with that level, direct quality that she'd never quite gotten used to. I'm far too old for your future, she said. The words came out even, which cost her more than she would have admitted. You have decades ahead of you. You'll want... Don't, he said. A family, children. Eleanor. He said her name quietly, but with enough weight that she stopped. He stood up then, slowly, and he didn't come closer, just stood there across the table from her with his hat still in his hands. Don't tell me what I'll want. I know what I want. I've known for a while. Then you're being foolish. Maybe. He said it without defensiveness. I've been called worse. I can't. She stopped, tried again. This doesn't make sense. Most things that matter don't, he said. Right away. She looked at him across the kitchen of her worn-down trading post in the middle of the frozen Blackstone Mountains, this young man who fixed her fences and ate her soup and had spent 4 months proving with nothing but his actions that he meant exactly what he said. And she felt that complicated thing turn over in her chest again, and this time it turned hard. You don't know me, she said, and she was angry, not at him, or not only at him, but at the whole impossible arithmetic of it. You don't know what I'm like when things get bad. You don't know how tired I am most days. You don't know... I know enough, he said, and I'd like to learn the rest. The wind worked at the eaves, snow ticked against the glass. Eleanor Grayson stood in her kitchen and looked at Silas Rowan and could not find a single thing to say that felt true and also safe at the same time. She was still trying to find it when they heard the horses. Not one horse, not two. Many. Moving fast up the trail from the south. Silas's hand went to his rifle before she could draw another breath, and whatever had been happening in her kitchen, whatever fragile, complicated thing had been finding its shape in the space between them, vanished into the cold clarity of the sound of men riding hard in the dark. Put out the lamp, Silas said quietly. Eleanor moved without being told to. The trading post went dark, and out of the black winter night, Caleb Voss arrived to collect what the mountains owed him. The lamp had been out for less than 30 seconds when the first rider reached the front of the property. Eleanor stood in the dark kitchen with her back pressed against the far wall, breathing through her nose in slow, deliberate pulls the way she'd taught herself to do years ago during the bad winters when panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her eyes were adjusting. Silas had moved to the front room without making a sound, and she could just make out his silhouette beside the window, rifle already off his shoulder, his body tilted to see through the gap between the shutter and the frame. She counted hoofbeats. 6 horses? Maybe 7. They'd come off the main trail and pulled up in the yard without any attempt at quiet, which told her something right away. Men who rode in silence were men who were worried about being heard. Men who rode in like this, loud, unhurried, careless, were men who didn't think they had anything to worry about. That was worse. "How many can you see?" she said, barely above a whisper. 5 in front. Could be more around the side. He didn't move from the window. "You have a weapon back there?" "Thomas's old shotgun. Under the counter." "Get it." She went to the counter by feel, pulling open the lower panel and reaching into the dark until her hands found the familiar weight of it. It hadn't been fired in 2 years, and she wasn't sure about the shells, but it was something solid and heavy, and right now solid and heavy was what she needed. Outside, one of the riders swung down from his horse. She heard boots on packed snow, then on the porch steps, then a fist on her front door. Not a knock exactly, more like someone establishing ownership of a surface that didn't belong to them yet. Eleanor Grayson. The voice was male, mid-range, with a flatness to it that suggested he said most things the same way regardless of the content. "We know you're in there. Saw your lamp go out. Open the door or we'll open it ourselves, and I promise you our way makes more of a mess." Silas looked back at her across the dark room. She could see enough of his face to read the question. She shook her head once. "Not yet." "Last time I'm asking politely," the voice said. "I heard you the first time," Eleanor called back, louder than she felt. She came around the counter and stood in the middle of the front room, shotgun low at her side, and she was glad it was dark because her hands were shaking slightly, and she didn't want Silas to see it. "I'm not in the habit of opening my door to strangers in the middle of the night. You want to buy something? Come back in the morning." A pause. Then, almost amused, "We're not here to buy anything." "Then what are you here for?" "Have a conversation with you about property rights." Another pause, longer this time. "And about a man named Thomas Grayson." The name hit her differently than she expected. Not like grief, she was long past that, but like a cold hand laid flat against the back of her neck. She kept her face still even though there was no one in front of her who could see it. "Thomas Grayson has been dead 8 years, she said. "Yes, ma'am, we know that too." Silas had gone very still by the window. Eleanor looked at him and found him already looking at her. And in the dim light coming through the gap in the shutters, she couldn't read his expression well, but she could see that his jaw was set and his hand on the rifle was not relaxed. "Open the door, Mrs. Grayson," the voice said. "We'll explain everything. You have my word, nobody gets hurt tonight as long as you cooperate." Words like cooperate from men who rode in 8 to a property at night. She had been in enough hard situations to know that word was doing a lot of heavy lifting. She crossed to the door and lifted the bolt. Silas shifted position immediately, putting himself at an angle to the door where he'd have a sightline the moment it opened. She registered this without looking directly at him, the way you register someone's breathing in a dark room, peripherally, by instinct. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch was not what she'd pictured from the voice. She'd pictured someone older, heavier, more obviously dangerous in the blunt way that a rock or a closed fist was dangerous. Caleb Voss was none of those things. He was perhaps 40, lean as wire, with a face that had been handsome once and had gone sharp instead of soft as he aged. He wore a good coat, better than anything men out here usually wore, and a hat with the brim level, not pulled down the way men pulled theirs when they were uncertain. He stood on her porch like a man who expected the world to arrange itself around him, and was frequently correct about this. Behind him, 4 men waited at the base of the steps. She could see more shapes at the edges of the yard. Voss looked at her for a moment. Not the way men sometimes looked at women, cataloging and assessing, but a different kind of survey, cooler and more thorough. Then his eyes moved past her into the dark of the store, and she saw the smallest change in his expression. "You've got company," he said. "I've got a shotgun," she said. Same difference. Something like appreciation crossed his face, brief as a cloud shadow. "Mrs. Grayson, I'm Caleb Voss. I'm going to be straight with you because I find it saves time. I don't have anything personal against you. But your husband, God rest him, Made some decisions before he died that created a situation. And that situation has followed me north to your door. Now." He tilted his head slightly. "Can we talk about this inside, or would you prefer the whole conversation happen on the porch where it's 17 degrees? She stepped back from the door because there was no good alternative. Voss came in alone, which told her he was either very confident or very reckless. And from what she'd already seen, she suspected it was the former. He stopped just inside the door, letting his eyes adjust, and then he saw Silas standing in the shadows with the rifle, and he went absolutely still. The stillness lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then something happened to Voss's face that was not quite an expression, more like the shadow of one, there and gone before she could name it. "Well," he said quietly, "I'll be damned." Silas said nothing. The rifle didn't move. "You're a long way from the Powder River, Rowan." Voss said the name with the particular casualness of someone demonstrating that they aren't surprised, which meant they were. "Didn't expect to find you up here in the woman's trading post." "I go where I need to go," Silas said. "Sure you do." Voss turned back to Eleanor with the careful movement of a man making certain not to do anything that looked sudden. "You know who this is, Mrs. Grayson, the man standing in your store?" "I know who he is." "Do you know what he does? Beyond fixing fences, I mean." "Caleb." Silas's voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, flat and cold in the way that a river went flat before it dropped. "Say what you came to say." Voss looked between them for a moment. Then he turned to Eleanor and said, without any particular drama, "Your husband stole $40,000 in railroad gold." The room was very quiet. Eleanor heard the wind against the shutters. She heard one of the horses outside stamp and blow. She heard her own blood in her ears. "That's not possible," she said. "I wish that were true. Would make this simpler." Voss moved to her counter and leaned against it in a way that suggested he'd decided the immediate situation wasn't going to turn lethal in the next 60 seconds, and had adjusted his posture accordingly. 19 years ago, Thomas Grayson worked as a freight coordinator for the Sierra Pacific Line out of Hollings. He had access to cargo manifests, loading schedules. He and 2 other men intercepted a gold shipment in the Alcott Pass, 40 bars, bound for the Federal Mint in Carson City. They killed the 2 guards. "Thomas wasn't—" She stopped. Her mouth had gone dry. "I know what he was to you," Voss said. "Not unkindly, which was somehow worse than cruelty. But people are generally a few different things at once, Mrs. Grayson. His partners were caught inside the year. Thomas wasn't. He'd already used his cut of the gold to buy land up here, build this place, build you both a life." He paused. "The problem is the gold was never recovered. His partners went to their graves swearing Thomas had the lion's share, closer to 30 bars, hidden somewhere on the property." Eleanor's hands were very steady now. The shaking had stopped sometime in the last 2 minutes, replaced by a stillness that she recognized as the particular quiet her body produced when things became bad enough that panic was no longer a useful option. "You said Thomas's partners were caught," she said. "You said they died." "Their organization didn't." Voss looked at her steadily. "I work for the men who've been waiting 20 years to recover that gold. I'm not going to pretend that's a noble enterprise, but I'm also not here to burn your house down if you'll simply help us find what we're looking for. And if I don't know where it is, then we look together. And when you find it," Voss smiled for the first time. It didn't make him look friendlier. "We go away." The shot came from outside, sharp and flat through the winter air, and it wasn't aimed at the building. It was a signal. Eleanor felt it in her chest before she understood what it meant, and then she understood. Someone outside had spotted something, or someone. Silas was already moving. "Down," he said, and Eleanor dropped behind the counter on instinct as he put himself beside the front window and looked out fast, then pulled back. "2 men coming around the east side," he said. "They found my horse." Voss had straightened from the counter. The easy manner was gone, replaced by something faster and more angular. "Rowan, this doesn't have to—" Silas kicked the front door open and fired twice into the yard. Everything came apart at once. The sound of the rifle in the enclosed porch was enormous, and Eleanor heard men shouting outside and boots on the steps, and she came up from behind the counter with the shotgun, and she fired without entirely thinking about it toward the shape that appeared in the doorway, Not Voss, someone else. One of the men from outside who'd come in behind the noise. The blast took him in the shoulder and he went backward off the porch. Her ears were ringing. She pumped the shotgun and her hands worked even though she couldn't feel them properly. Silas had gone out the front. She could hear shooting. His rifle, then other guns, then silence, then his rifle again. Glass broke in the back room. She turned and saw a shape at the rear window, and she brought the shotgun up and the shape disappeared. Then Voss's voice, from somewhere outside, carrying over the confusion with the practiced ease of a man who'd given orders in chaotic places before. Pull back! Pull back! We're done for tonight. More shouting, a horse screaming somewhere. Busos, the high panicked sound of an animal that has heard too many guns too close. Then hoofbeats, multiple sets, moving away south down the trail and diminishing. Then quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after violence, which is different from every other kind. Eleanor stood in the middle of her front room with the shotgun in her hands and broken glass on the floor and a smell in the air that she recognized from nowhere, except that it was unmistakable once you'd been in a room where guns had been fired. Her ears were still ringing, a high, thin note like a wire pulled taut. Silas came back through the front door. He was bleeding from a cut on his left forearm. She could see the dark stain spreading through the canvas of his coat, and he was breathing harder than she'd ever seen him breathe before. He looked at her first, right away, before anything else. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing serious." He looked around the room quickly. The broken glass, the door hanging at a wrong angle, a lamp that had fallen and somehow not caught fire. "You're all right?" "I'm all right." He let out a breath. Then he went to the window and looked out at the dark yard for a long moment. "They'll be back," he said. "I know." "Voss doesn't give up. He'll come back with more men and a different approach." He turned from the window. "We have to decide what we're going to do." Eleanor set the shotgun on the counter. Her hands were shaking again now, which she found almost a relief. It meant her body was returning to normal operation, processing the aftermath. She'd rather shake now than during. "Tell me about Caleb Voss," she said. "Not what he told me in there. Tell me what you know." Silas came away from the window and sat down heavily in the chair by the cold stove. He pressed the back of his hand against the cut on his arm for a moment, checking how bad it was, then apparently decided it could wait. "Voss runs enforcement for a man named Aldrich Crane," he said. "Crane has money in a dozen things: cattle, freight, some mining operations. But the money he cares about is the kind that doesn't get written down. Gold, mostly. He's been financing recovery operations for stolen shipments for 15 years. He sends Voss. Voss finds what he's looking for." A pause. "Usually." "And your brother?" Silas looked at his hands. "My brother was a Wells Fargo detective. He was investigating one of Crane's recovery operations, trying to build a case against Voss specifically. He got too close." His voice remained even, but something beneath it was not. "They found him in a dry creek bed outside of Reno, December, 2 years ago." "I'm sorry. I'd been following Voss's trail for a year before I came through this pass." He looked up at her. "I didn't know about your husband. I didn't know any of this was here. I want you to understand that." "I believe you." He nodded. Then, "You didn't know about Thomas." She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I knew things didn't always add up," she said slowly. "The money for this property came faster than it should have from honest merchant work. There were times he'd go quiet about certain things in a way that I learned not to press on." She looked at the wall, at nothing in particular. "I told myself the explanation was something small, something ordinary that he was embarrassed about, a debt or a bad deal he didn't want to admit to." She was quiet for a moment. "I wanted the explanation to be small." Silas said nothing, which was the right thing. "He was a decent enough husband," she said, and she was aware of how much was compressed into that word enough and what it cost her to say it simply and without decoration. "Not a warm man, not someone who made the winters shorter, but he worked hard and he didn't raise his hand and he didn't leave." A pause. "Or I thought he didn't leave." She caught herself on the last sentence, hearing it land wrong, and then left it where it fell because this was not the time for that particular door. "We need to search the property," Silas said, "for the gold. If it exists, and I think it does, Voss is going to tear this place apart looking for it. Better we find it first. At least then we have something to work with. Work with how? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I don't know yet, but empty hands are worse than full ones. She looked at him across the cold kitchen. This man who was bleeding from her fight, who had come north to chase one ghost and stumbled into hers, who had looked at her an hour ago across this same table with something real and complicated in his eyes and told her he knew what he wanted. She thought about the distance between the person she'd been for the last 8 years, careful, contracted, useful in a functional way, and whatever was on the other side of a night like this. There's a cellar, she said. He looked up. Beneath the storage room. Thomas built it the first year. I use it for root vegetables in summer, but there's a section in the back, a wall that doesn't match the rest of the construction. I always figured it was just poor carpentry. She stopped. I never looked at it as anything else. Silas stood up. Show me, he said. They took the lamp, low, with the shutters on the windows, and went through the back room to the narrow panel in the floor that opened onto the cellar steps. The air coming up was cold and dark and smelled of turned earth and old wood, and Eleanor led the way down because she knew where to put her feet. The cellar was maybe 15 feet by 12, with rough-cut timber walls and a dirt floor that stayed cold enough year-round to keep things from spoiling badly. Eleanor moved to the back wall with the lamp held up. In its light, the difference was obvious once you looked for it. The back wall was newer timber, cut differently, fitted together with a precision that the rest of the cellar didn't have. Silas came up beside her. He ran his hand along the seam where the wall met the floor, pressing in different places, working his way left until his hand stopped. He pressed, and something gave. Not much. Half an inch? A slight pivot, but enough that they could see the seam of a door that had been built to look like a wall. Silas found the edge with his fingers and pulled. The door swung outward on hinges that had been greased recently enough that they barely made a sound, which told Eleanor something that made her stomach drop. Thomas had greased those hinges. Not years ago. Months before he died, or whenever the last time was that he'd opened this. Beyond the door was a space the size of a large wardrobe, dug back into the earth. And on the floor of that space, sitting in the dirt under 8 years of dust and the quiet dark, was a heavy iron chest with a bar lock that had been bolted from the outside. They looked at it for a moment without speaking. "Can you open it?" Eleanor said. Silas pulled his belt knife and worked it into the lock mechanism. It was old and the cold had contracted the metal, and it took him 4 minutes of working that she could see cost him something with his injured arm. Then the lock turned and he lifted the lid. Gold bars. Dull and dense and stacked in 3 layers, filling the chest to within an inch of the top. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. Doubt, maybe, the relief of finding nothing, but the sight of it hit her somewhere between her stomach and her chest. So it was true. All of it. Silas reached into the chest and moved the top layer carefully, checking the space beneath. His hand found something that wasn't metal. He pulled out a bundle of papers tied with old twine. Letters, maybe 30 of them, the envelopes worn at the edges, the ink on the topmost one faded, but readable. He looked at her. She looked at the letters. "You don't have to read them tonight," he said. "Hand them to me." He did. The top letter was addressed in Thomas's handwriting. She knew it immediately, the tight, slanted script he used. But it wasn't addressed to her. The name on the envelope was a woman's name she didn't recognize, and the postmark was from a town 300 miles west, and it was dated 6 months before Thomas died. Her hands were very steady as she opened it. She read the first paragraph standing in the cellar with the lamp held in one hand and the paper in the other, and what she read was not the confession of a man who had stolen and hidden and lied. It was a love letter. A detailed, specific, completely ordinary love letter from Thomas Grayson to a woman named Cora Vane, describing the life he was planning for the two of them in California, the money he had set aside, the spring when he intended to leave. She didn't read the rest of it. She didn't need to. 16 years of marriage, 8 years of widowhood, during which she had carried quietly and mostly alone the guilt of a woman who suspected she had never been quite enough, not warm enough, not easy enough to love, not sufficient to make a decent man want to stay. She folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. "Eleanor," Silas said, "I'm all right." "You don't have to be all right." She looked at him then. And something in her face must have been plainly visible because he didn't say anything else. He just stood there in the cold dark of the cellar and waited. The way he'd learned to wait, without making the silence into a demand. She was not going to cry in a cellar over Thomas Grayson. She made that decision with the same flat practicality she'd applied to most of the hardest things in her life. Maybe later. Not now. What she felt beneath the cold shock of it was something she hadn't expected. Something that felt inconveniently and unmistakably like the first breath after a long time underwater. "He was going to leave," she said. Not quite a question. Not quite a statement. "Looks that way." She set the bundle of letters on top of the gold. 30 bars, she said. Her voice was level. $40,000. And Voss is coming back with more men to take it. Yes. Then we need a plan. She turned and looked at the iron chest, at the lamplight catching the dull gleam of the bars. "Because I am not running." Silas looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like confirmation of something he'd already suspected about her. "No," he said. "I didn't think you would be." They stood in the cellar of her trading post in the middle of the frozen Blackstone Mountains, with 30 bars of stolen gold at their feet, and a dead man's letters on top of them, and an unknown number of armed men somewhere south on the trail. And Eleanor Grayson felt the last of the old weight begin to shift in her chest. Not gone. Not yet. But loosening. She picked up the lamp. "Come on," she said. "Your arm needs looking at, and we have a lot of work to do before morning." She cleaned his arm by lamplight at the kitchen table, working with the efficient hands of a woman who had spent 14 years in a place where the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride in good weather and 4 in bad. The cut was deep enough to need binding, but not deep enough to need more than that. Which was fortunate because all she had was clean linen strips and a bottle of whiskey she kept for exactly this kind of purpose, and almost never touched otherwise. Silas sat with his coat off and his jaw set and said nothing while she worked, which she appreciated. Men who made noise about pain were harder to treat because you spent half your attention managing them instead of the wound. "Hold still," she said, pulling the linen tight. "I am holding still." "You're flinching. That's not the same as not holding still." She tied off the bandage and sat back. He rotated his arm experimentally, testing the range of movement, then nodded once, his version of approval. Outside, the wind had dropped to something manageable, which was the mountain's way of pretending the night had been ordinary. The yard was empty as far as she could tell, but she'd shuttered all the windows after the shooting, and she wasn't going to unshutter them until she had a better sense of what Voss had left behind, if anything. "He'll come back in daylight," Silas said. He was looking at the kitchen wall the way he looked at things he was thinking through. Not seeing the wall, seeing past it. Voss doesn't like working in the dark if he has a choice. Too many variables. Then we have a few hours. A few hours to do what, exactly? Eleanor had been thinking about this since the cellar. She'd been thinking about it while she looked at Thomas's letters, and while she carried the lamp back upstairs, and while she boiled water for the linen strips, running the problem the same way she ran the trading post's accounts. Not looking for a perfect solution, but for the best available one, given what she actually had. "But we can't outrun them," she said, "not in February with the pass road the way it is. Even if we loaded horses tonight, they'd catch us before we reached Harrow." "Agreed. And we can't wait them out. Once Voss goes back and gets reinforcements, we don't have the firepower to hold this building." "Also agreed." "So we don't do either of those things." She looked at him across the table. "We make them come to us on terms we've set, not theirs." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about using the gold." "I'm talking about using everything." The plan she laid out over the next hour was not elegant. She would have been the first to say so. It had the rough shape of something built from available materials rather than ideal ones, which was the only kind of plan she'd ever trusted anyway. Elegant plans required circumstances to cooperate, and circumstances had never cooperated with Eleanor Grayson in her life. What she proposed was this. They would spend the remaining dark hours reinforcing the trading post as a defensible position, not because they intended to fight from it indefinitely, but because they needed Voss to believe they were dug in for a siege. Meanwhile, they would identify every exit from the property, including the one she'd never told anyone about. "What exit?" Silas said. "Thomas didn't just build a hidden cellar," she said. He built a way out of it. She explained about the tunnel. She'd found it by accident 3 years into her widowhood, moving barrels in the cellar's back section and discovering that the earth behind the false wall didn't just conceal the iron chest. It concealed a passage, narrow and low, that ran approximately 60 feet north-northeast before emerging behind a rock shelf at the base of the ridge. Thomas had shored it up with timber, well enough that it had survived 8 winters without collapsing. She had no idea when he dug it or how, only that he had, and that she'd kept it to herself in the unexamined way. You kept things that felt like a secret even when you didn't know what they were a secret from. Now she knew. Silas listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He built a hidden cellar, filled it with stolen gold, and dug a tunnel out of it." "Yes. And you stayed in this house for 8 years. "I didn't know about the gold." "I know." He rubbed his face with his good hand. I'm not saying it to criticize you, Eleanor. I'm just—" He stopped, started again. Thomas Grayson was a more complicated man than I expected. "He was a more complicated man than I expected too," she said. "And I was married to him." Silas looked at her for a moment, reading something in her face, and then he nodded and let it go. "The tunnel is our exit," he said, "if we need it. When we need it." "When we need it." He accepted the correction. "But if we're going to use the gold as leverage, we need to move it first. Or some of it. We can't carry all 30 bars through a 60-foot tunnel." "We don't need all 30 bars," she said. "We need enough to make Voss believe he's winning." He looked at her steadily. "Walk me through it. Voss wants the gold. That's what he came for. The reason we're still alive is that he doesn't know exactly where it is. He knows it's somewhere on the property, and he needs us cooperative enough to help him find it. If he believed he could get it without us, he'd have already burned the building." She paused. "So, we let him find the cellar. We let him find the chest, but we make sure that when he opens it, he finds only part of what was there. And the rest goes with us, through the tunnel." Silas turned this over. She could see him checking it for holes, which was what she'd been doing since the cellar, and she already knew what the largest hole was. "It only works," he said slowly, "if Voss doesn't pursue. If he's satisfied with what's in the chest and lets us go." "He won't be satisfied," she said. "Voss doesn't strike me as a man who accepts partial payment." "Then what's the point of—" "The point is the distraction. The point is the time it buys us while he's down in the cellar, counting bars and calculating how many are missing. That time is the difference between getting through the tunnel before they circle the building and not getting through it." Silas sat with this for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up briefly, rattling the shutter on the back window, then dropped again. "It might work," he said, in the tone of someone who thought it might not. "It's what we have," she said. They worked through the rest of the dark hours with the focused grimness of two people who know they won't get more sleep but don't say so out loud. Silas reinforced the front door with a timber bar and used what lumber she had in the storage room to shore up the east-facing shutters, which were the oldest and most likely to fail. Eleanor went to the cellar and spent an hour in the cold transferring gold bars from the iron chest into 2 canvas supply sacks, choosing the largest she could carry and still move at reasonable speed. She left 14 bars in the chest, rearranged to fill the visible top layer, the way you arrange the last few items in a depleted pantry to make the shelves look fuller than they were. While she worked, she found herself picking up Thomas's letters without intending to. She didn't read them again. She just sat there on the cold dirt floor with them in her hands for a minute or two, feeling their weight, which was less than she'd expected for something that had taken so much from her. Then she put them back on top of the remaining gold bars and closed the chest and relatched the lock. She thought about what it meant that he'd planned to leave. She turned it over the way you turned a stone over to see what lived underneath, and she found, to her own careful surprise, that the thing living underneath wasn't what she'd expected. It wasn't grief. She'd done her grieving, or enough of it. It wasn't anger. Or it was anger, briefly, and then the anger passed through her like weather and left something quieter in its place. What she felt, sitting in the cellar in the dark with her dead husband's secret in her hands, was a kind of settling. The specific physical sensation of a weight being redistributed, not removed, but shifted to a place where it sat differently against her body. For 8 years she had carried the quiet, unspoken question of whether she had been insufficient, whether the coldness of their marriage had been her failing, whether a different woman, warmer or easier or less difficult in the particular ways Eleanor was difficult, might have made Thomas Grayson into the man she'd wanted him to be. The letters answered that question, and the answer was that she had never been the variable. She climbed back out of the cellar with the 2 canvas sacks over her shoulders and a straighter spine than she'd gone down with. Silas was in the front room when she came through, testing the shutter latches. He looked at her face when she came in and read something in it that made him not ask questions, which was the right instinct. "Ready?" he said instead. "Almost." She set the sacks down and went to the shelf behind her counter, where she kept the things she actually valued. Not inventory, but the small accumulated evidence of a life. A tin box with her mother's wedding ring in it. The deed to the property, folded in oilcloth. A photograph. One of the old kind where everyone looked stiff because they had to hold still so long, of herself and Thomas taken the year they moved to the mountains. She looked at the photograph for a moment, then left it where it was. She took the tin box and the deed. Dawn came in the way February dawns came in the Blackstone. Gray first, then slightly less gray. The darkness thinning rather than breaking, until there was just enough light to see by, and the shadows had retreated to the tree line. Silas came to stand beside her at the front window, both of them looking out at the yard and the trail and the tree line to the south. "How long do you think we have?" she said. "Voss will want full light. He had 2 men hurt last night, maybe 3. He'll need time to reorganize." He paused. 2 hours. Maybe 3. Then we wait. Waiting was the hardest part. Eleanor had always found this in every difficult situation she'd lived through. The action itself was manageable, even when it was terrible, because it absorbed all of you and left no room for anything else. It was the waiting before the action that let the fear back in through the cracks. She made coffee because the alternative was standing at the window until her legs gave out. Silas sat at the kitchen table and cleaned his rifle with the methodical care of a man who did it the way other men prayed. Not because he expected it to save him, but because it was the thing his hands knew how to do when his mind needed to be somewhere else. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said, her back to him, watching the coffee. "You can ask." "Last night, before they came." She paused, choosing words with care. "What you said." He didn't answer right away. She turned around and found him looking at her with the direct, uncomplicated honesty she'd spent months trying to find an ulterior motive behind, and never had. "I meant it," he said. "If that's what you're asking. I'm asking whether you've thought about what it would actually look like." "Some. I'm not easy to be around. I know that about myself." She said it without apology or performance. "I've been on my own a long time, and I've gotten set in how I do things, and I'm not going to change that because someone thinks I ought to be softer. I'm not asking you to be softer. And I have nothing to offer you in the way of—" She stopped, frustrated with herself for not having the right shape for what she was trying to say. "I'm 43 years old, and I have debt and a trading post that might burn down today. Eleanor, I'm being serious. So am I." He set the rifle down. "I'm not asking for a negotiation. I'm not asking for anything right now except for you to know that what I said, I meant. The rest of it we can figure out if we survive the day." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a fairly large if." "Yes," he said, "it is." The first rider appeared at the tree line shortly before 8 in the morning. Eleanor saw him from the front window. A single horseman sitting still at the edge of the pines, watching the building. A scout, checking whether anyone had run in the night. She pulled back from the shutter before he could see movement. "They're here," she said. Silas was on his feet immediately, rifle in hand, moving to the angle of the window he'd used the night before. "How many?" "One visible. More behind him in the trees." He looked. "I count 3 horses in the pines. Could be more." He pulled back. "Voss will come in from 2 directions this time. He's not going to make the same mistake twice." They had maybe 10 minutes, possibly less. "Cellar door," she said. Leave it open? Leave it slightly open. Obvious enough that a man looking for something would notice it. Not so obvious it looks staged." He went to the storage room and came back in 40 seconds. "Done. The sacks are at the bottom of the tunnel stairs." "I know. I put them there." Of course he had. She looked around the front room, The broken glass she hadn't swept up, the lamp that had fallen and not caught, the timber bar across the front door, the shotgun on the counter with 2 shells left in it. The physical record of a night she would spend a long time unpacking later, assuming later was something she got. Silas. She turned to him. He was already looking at her. If something goes wrong, she started. Don't. Let me finish. If something goes wrong and only one of us makes it through the tunnel, the sacks go with whoever that is. Don't stop. Don't come back. Eleanor, I'm serious. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she could see him deciding whether to argue and deciding not to. Not because he agreed with her, she knew, but because he understood that she needed to say it. Same goes for you, he said quietly. Outside, more riders came out of the trees. She counted 6 from the window, then 8. Then she stopped counting. Voss came last, riding a dark horse, unhurried, and he stopped in the center of the yard and looked at the building the way he'd looked at her the night before, with the patient assessment of a man who believed he had already won and was simply working out the administrative details. He called out from horseback, Mrs. Grayson, I've got 12 men with me this time, and I've got someone with a torch at the back of the building. I'm going to give you 60 seconds to open that door before I give him the word. Silas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the cellar door, left ajar in the storage room. Then she looked at the 2 canvas sacks that were not visible from where Voss sat on his horse. Trust the plan, she said, mostly to herself. She lifted the timber bar from the front door and opened it. Voss rode his horse to the base of the steps and looked down at her from the saddle with something that might have been respect if it had been a different situation. Where's Rowan? He said. Gone, she said. He left before dawn. We had a disagreement about what to do, and he made his choice. Voss studied her face. She held it still and gave him nothing, which was a skill she'd developed over years of difficult men at her counter and difficult months at the bank. You going to tell me where the gold is? He said. I'm going to show you, she said, because I want you to take it and leave and not come back. Whatever Thomas did, whatever he owed, take it and go. She led him into the building herself, which was her choice and not Silas's, and she watched Voss's eyes find the cellar door in the storage room within 10 seconds of entering the back of the building, which told her everything she needed to know about how carefully he'd prepared for this morning. He sent 2 men down first, which was smart. She heard them moving around in the cellar, and then a shout. Not alarm, triumph, and then the sound of the iron chest being dragged across the dirt floor. Voss stood in the storage room doorway and looked at her while his men worked below. His expression was almost pleasant. 14 bars, one of the men called up. Heavy ones. Something changed in Voss's face. Not anger. Not yet. More like the first cold breath of it, still controlled, the way a fire looked just before it caught. 14, he said very quietly. That's what Thomas left, Eleanor said. Thomas had 30. Thomas had many things he never told me about. She held his gaze. 14 bars of railroad gold is what's in that chest. That's what I can give you. The pleasant expression was entirely gone now. Voss looked at her with the flat, patient attention of someone doing a calculation, and Eleanor could feel him running the numbers. How much time she'd had, what she could realistically have moved, where the rest might be. And she kept her face still and her breathing even, and she counted silently. 1, 2, 3. Behind her, from somewhere in the building that sounded like the kitchen, she heard a sound that wasn't Voss's men. A small, specific sound. The creak of a particular floorboard, the third one from the left in the kitchen, the one she'd been meaning to fix since September. Silas, who was supposed to be at the tunnel entrance, waiting. She did not look toward the kitchen. 4, 5. There's more gold on this property, Voss said. I gave you what I have. I don't believe you. I know you don't. She didn't flinch. But I also know you're a practical man. 14 bars is 14 bars. You can spend the next week tearing apart every floorboard and ridge line on this property, looking for the rest, and maybe you find something and maybe you don't. Or you can take what's in that chest and be 4 days south of here before the next storm comes in. Voss looked at her for what felt like a very long time. Then something shifted behind his eyes. Not agreement, but the decision to defer the disagreement. Get the chest up, he said to the men below. Eleanor stood in her storage room and watched them haul the iron chest up the cellar steps, with the controlled effort of men who understood the weight of what they were carrying, and she kept counting silently. And she did not look toward the kitchen, and she did not look toward the storage closet in the back corner where the tunnel entrance was concealed behind a false wall that Thomas had built with the same careful deception he'd apparently applied to everything in his life. And then she smelled smoke. Not wood smoke. The specific wrong smell of something catching that shouldn't, of oil and old timber and the particular acrid quality of a fire that hadn't been set in a fireplace. She looked up. Through the small gap at the top of the rear shutter, she could see the orange edge of something that was not dawn light. The man with the torch at the back of the building. Voss had given the word before he came inside. The negotiation, the chest, the counting of bars, it had all been performance. He'd decided before he rode into the yard that the building was going to burn regardless. "You already told him," she said. Voss looked at her with something that might have been regret if he were built differently. "I told you I had 12 men, Mrs. Grayson. I didn't say they were all waiting on my instruction." The smoke was thickening. She could hear it now. The particular low roar of something feeding, growing, finding more of itself to consume. She had perhaps 4 minutes before the back of the building was fully involved. She had 30 feet between her and the storage closet, and Caleb Voss was standing directly between her and it. "Eleanor." Silas's voice from the kitchen doorway, level and clear. Voss turned. Silas fired. The shot took the man on Voss's left before he could bring his weapon up. And then everything came apart for the second time in 12 hours, and Eleanor stopped counting and ran. She went right, not toward the kitchen where Silas was, not toward the front door where Voss's men were now pouring in, but right into the storage room, past the iron chest that 2 men were struggling to lift, past the cellar door, to the back corner and the false panel. She hit it with her shoulder and it gave, and she went through into the narrow dark beyond it, and her hands found the first canvas sack, and she got the strap over her shoulder, and then the second sack, and she was moving, bent low, into the tunnel, into the smell of cold earth and old timber, and somewhere behind her the sound of shooting and the growing sound of fire eating the building she had lived in for 14 years. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. 60 feet of dark, and the weight of the gold on her back, and the tunnel pressing in on both sides, and the cold coming up from the earth floor, and she kept moving. And somewhere behind her she heard the tunnel entrance open again, and footsteps, and she said nothing, asked nothing, just kept moving toward the cold air. She could already feel against her face from the other end. The rock shelf at the tunnel's exit was crusted with ice, and she came out of it on her hands and knees into the February morning, her breath clouding, the canvas sacks dragging across the frozen ground. She turned immediately, back to the rock face, and looked toward the building. The rear wall was burning openly now, orange and black, and the smoke was going straight up in the cold air like a signal. She could hear shouting from the front of the property, Voss's men, organizing, but not yet coming around the north side. She heard movement in the tunnel behind her. Silas came out of the rock shelf 2 seconds later, one arm braced against the tunnel wall, his rifle in his other hand, and there was blood on his face from somewhere that hadn't been bleeding before, and he looked at her with the concentrated focus of a man accounting for something he'd been worried about. "Go," he said. "Are you?" "I'm fine. Go." She went. Up the ridge, into the tree line, into the cold white of the Blackstone Mountains, with 30 bars of stolen gold on her back, and the sound of her burning trading post dropping away below her, and for the first time in 8 years, Eleanor Grayson was moving towards something instead of simply standing her ground. And the difference between those two things was something she felt all the way through her chest. Behind her, Silas matched her pace. Steady, present. The smoke rose above the tree line in a black column that she imagined could be seen for miles. Let them see it. Let Voss stand in her yard and watch her home burn and think he had won something. In the Blackstone Mountains, in February, the cold had a way of clarifying what actually mattered, and Eleanor Grayson had never been clearer in her life. The tree line swallowed them within 2 minutes of leaving the tunnel, and Eleanor didn't slow down until the slope leveled enough that running became possible without the risk of going down hard on the ice. The canvas sacks cut into her shoulders with the particular cruelty of dead weight in motion, and she could feel the cold working into her lungs with every breath, that sharp interior ache that meant the temperature was well below zero and the body was registering its objections. She didn't stop. Behind her, Silas moved without complaint, matching her pace through the pine stands and the broken terrain of the ridge's lower skirt. The blood on his face had come from a cut above his right eyebrow. She'd seen it clearly when he came out of the tunnel, and it had run down and dried in the cold into a dark line along his jaw that made him look worse than he probably was. She cataloged this the way she cataloged everything now, quickly and without dwelling, storing it for later when later was an available option. They climbed for 20 minutes before Silas touched her elbow, and she stopped. He stood still, listening. She listened too. Wind in the upper pines, the distant sound of something that might have been the fire still working on the trading post's bones, a raven calling from somewhere to the east. Nothing that sounded like men on horses. "They'll find the tunnel," he said quietly. His breath was heavy, but controlled. "Maybe 20 minutes before someone thinks to look at the north side of the ridge." "Will Voss come himself?" "Voss will come himself." No hesitation. "He's not going to send men to do something this personal. Not now." He looked back down the slope through the trees, calculating. "And he's going to be angry about the gold count. 14 bars is less than half of what he expected. He's going to want the rest, and he's going to want it badly enough to do something reckless." Eleanor shifted the sack on her left shoulder, trying to redistribute the weight. "Good." He looked at her. "Good?" "Reckless men make mistakes." He held her gaze for a moment, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of one. Then he looked up the slope. "There's a ridge line about a mile above us," he said. "I know it from the trapping circuit. It runs east along the face of the Blackstone before it drops into the Henderson Creek Valley. If we can get above it, we'll have the high ground and sight lines in 3 directions. And the 4th direction? Straight down, 200 feet of rock face." She considered this. "So we'd be cornered." "We'd be positioned," he said. "There's a difference. On flat ground with this much gold and 2 weapons between us, we lose. On that ridge, we control who gets close and from which direction." Eleanor looked up through the pines at the sky, which was the flat white of a February morning that hadn't decided yet whether it would snow. The cold was settling in her fingers despite her gloves, and she flexed them against the sack straps to keep the blood moving. "How long to reach it?" "At this pace with these sacks, 40 minutes, maybe 50. "Then we should move," she said. They moved. The climb was not the worst physical experience of Eleanor's life. That category was occupied by a 3-day illness she'd survived alone in her second winter at the trading post, when she'd been convinced for about 48 hours that she was going to die on her kitchen floor and be found in the spring thaw. But it was in the conversation. The slope steepened in the second half mile, transitioning from manageable grade to something that required hands-on rock in 2 places, and the gold made every upward step a negotiation between what her body wanted to do and what she was requiring it to do instead. She didn't ask for help. Silas didn't offer it in a way that would have required her to accept or refuse. What he did instead was position himself slightly below and to her left on the 2 worst sections, not touching her, not bracing her, just there, close enough that if her footing went, he could do something about it before she went far. She noticed this and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. At the 50-minute mark, they came out onto the ridge. It was exactly what he'd described, a narrow shelf of exposed granite running east along the mountain face, maybe 8 feet wide at its broadest, with pine scrub at the back edge and open air at the front. From where she stood, Eleanor could see the valley floor far below, the dark line of the trail coming up from the south, and in the middle distance, a faint thread of black smoke rising from where her trading post had been. She looked at the smoke for a moment. Just a moment. Then she set the canvas sacks down against the back rock and stretched her shoulders and turned to look at the approach. The ridge was accessible from the west, the way they'd come, along a traverse that required single-file movement and offered no cover for at least 30 yards before the tree line. From the east, the shelf narrowed to nothing within 100 feet. Below, the rock face dropped sheer. Above, the mountain continued another 500 feet to bare stone and ice that nothing moved through in February. "You were right," she said. "It's a good position." "It's a defensible position," he said. "Not the same thing." "How many bullets do you have?" He checked without theater. 11 rounds for the rifle, 6 for my sidearm. I have 2 shells left in the shotgun." She looked at the shells, looked at the approach. 17 rounds total. against however many men Voss brought back. 12, he said last night. He lost at least one in the firefight at the building. Maybe two. Silas set his rifle against the rock face and used his good arm to push the hair back from the cut on his forehead, checking it by feel. Call it 10. 10 men and 17 rounds. Yes. So we need them to do most of the work for us. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of surprise, which was a very subtle thing. Just a slight adjustment in the set of his eyes. What did you have in mind? She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was not the same as agreeing, but meant he was taking it seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the western traverse. It could work, he said, with the same careful tone he'd used about the plan in the kitchen. If his lead men get close enough. They'll get close enough. Voss will send scouts first and come behind them. He won't expose himself until he thinks the position is manageable. And if they rush the traverse all at once instead of one or two at a time, then we use everything we have and hope the math works out better than it looks. He exhaled slowly through his nose. That's not a plan. That's a contingency. There's a difference? Yes, she said. A plan is what you intend to do. A contingency is what you do when the plan stops working. Every good plan has both. Silas looked at her for a moment with something on his face that she didn't have a precise name for and had stopped trying to name, because naming it felt like making a claim she wasn't ready to make in the middle of a ridge with 10 armed men somewhere below them. All right, he said. He picked up the rifle. Tell me where you want me. They positioned themselves with the sacks of gold against the back rock, visible from the traverse approach. Visible on purpose, the gold gleaming dully through the canvas where she'd opened the top of one sack slightly. Silas took the east edge of the shelf, where the rock gave him a natural brace for the rifle. Eleanor took the west side, closer to the traverse, with the shotgun and a pile of fist-sized rock she'd gathered from the ridge floor, because 2 shells only went so far, and the human instinct to avoid being hit by something thrown fast and hard didn't care much what that something was made of. They waited. Waiting the second time was different from waiting the first. The first time in the trading post, there had been the structure of a building around her and the comfort of familiar walls, and the possibility, however slim, that things might not come to violence. There was no such comfort on the ridge. The wind came across the open face steadily, not gusting, just a constant cold pressure that found every gap in her coat and her gloves and her collar. And the sky above had made up its mind about snow and was beginning to make good on it, fine, dry flakes that came sideways on the wind and didn't accumulate so much as sting. She was cold. She was tired in the specific dense way of a body that had been in sustained crisis for 14 hours. Her shoulders ached from the gold and her hands were stiff, and the cut on Silas's forehead had reopened slightly in the wind and was tracking a thin red line down the side of his face again. Neither of them talked much. There wasn't much to say that the situation hadn't already said. After a while, Silas said quietly, "For what it's worth, what I said in the kitchen, and again after." He was watching the traverse and not looking at her. "I want you to know it wasn't something I said because the circumstances seemed to call for it." "I know," she said. "I'm not a man who says things because circumstances call for them." "I know that too." He glanced at her then, briefly, before his eyes went back to the traverse. "Are you going to make me wait until we're off this mountain to know if there's any chance you—" "Yes," she said, a pause. "That's an answer, at least." "Silas." "I know. Focus. Focus," she agreed. The first scout appeared at the west end of the traverse 18 minutes after they'd taken position. He was good. She'd give him that. He came low and used the scrub pine for cover and stopped for a full minute at the tree line before committing to the open section, scanning the ridge shelf with the careful attention of a man who'd been in bad positions before and had learned from the experience. He saw the gold. She watched him see it, the slight forward tilt of his body, the brief stillness of someone recalibrating their assessment of the situation. He looked back toward the trees. A signal. Then he started across the traverse. Silas fired when the man was 15 feet onto the open section. The shot was deliberately wide, close enough to send rock chips off the granite 2 feet to the man's left, far enough that it was clearly a warning rather than an attempt. The scout dropped flat immediately, pressing himself against the rock, and from behind the tree line Eleanor heard voices, urgent, low. Then Voss's voice, carrying clearly even at this distance with that same flat authority, "Rowan, I know that's you. Come out where I can see you." Silas didn't answer. Voss again. "You've got nowhere to go. That ridge has one way on and one way off, and I've got 9 men covering the tree line. You're going to run out of bullets before I run out of men." "He's not wrong about the math," Silas said quietly to Eleanor. "He's wrong about one thing," she said. "What's that?" She looked at the canvas sack with the open top, at the gold bars catching what pale light came through the snowfall. Then she looked at the traverse. "He thinks we're defending a position. We're not." She picked up the heaviest bar from the top of the sack. It was dense and cold and required both hands. And she looked at Silas. "We're setting a trap." She raised her voice then, cutting across the wind toward the tree line. "Mr. Voss, I have 16 bars of gold on this ridge. The rest is at the bottom of the tunnel. You can collect it when you go back. I'm prepared to give you what I'm carrying in exchange for safe passage off this mountain." A long pause from the tree line. Then Voss, with the careful neutrality of a man running the math. "Come out where I can see you. Come up where I can see you," she said back. "Just you. Your men stay at the tree line." Another pause. Longer. She heard movement in the trees, men talking, repositioning. The scout on the traverse hadn't moved, still pressed flat against the rock, apparently deciding that the most intelligent thing he could do was stay exactly where he was until someone gave him a clear instruction to do otherwise. Then Voss appeared at the tree line. He came onto the traverse alone, which surprised her slightly. She hadn't actually expected him to do it, and for a moment she recalibrated her estimation of him. He was either very brave or very confident, or both. And she'd spent enough time reading men across a trading post counter to know that confidence and intelligence didn't always come in the same package, but in Voss's case she suspected they did, which made this more dangerous, not less. He came across at an unhurried walk, his coat open despite the cold, his hands visible and away from the sidearm on his right hip. The scout on the ground pushed himself up to a crouch as Voss passed and fell in 3 steps behind him, because that was the kind of authority Voss carried. The kind that reorganized the people around him without requiring words. They stopped 8 feet from the edge of the shelf. Voss looked at the gold sack, then at Eleanor, then at Silas and the rifle. His eyes moved over all of it with the systematic quality of a man pricing things. 16 bars, he said. 16, Eleanor said, and the rest is in the tunnel. What's left of it? Some of it didn't survive the fire. Gold melts, Mr. Voss, at high enough temperatures. He looked at her with the expression of a man who didn't entirely believe her but was doing the cost-benefit of pushing the point. "What do you want?" "I told you. Safe passage. You take the gold on this ridge and what's in the tunnel, and you leave this mountain and don't come back." "And Rowan? He's not part of this negotiation." Voss glanced at Silas. Something moved between them. The specific, charged recognition of 2 men who have been on opposite sides of something for long enough that the opposition has become its own kind of relationship. "You killed my brother," Silas said. Not loud, just clear. "I've done a lot of things," Voss said, with a weariness that was almost honest. "Cole Rowan, Dry Creek bed outside Reno, December 2 years ago." Something happened in Voss's face. Not guilt. She didn't think guilt was an emotion Voss experienced with any regularity, but recognition. The specific quality of a man being presented with an accounting he knew was accurate. "Your brother was going to testify," Voss said. "I know what he was going to do." "It wasn't personal." "It never is," Silas said. "To you." Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the sudden decisiveness of a man who has decided the conversation is over, he looked at Eleanor and said, "The gold." "It's yours," she said. She gestured toward the open sack. "Come and take it." Voss took 2 steps forward. Eleanor lifted the gold bar from beside her with both hands. The one she'd pulled from the sack 20 minutes ago, the heaviest one, the one she'd been holding against her leg where it wasn't visible from the traverse, and she threw it, not at his feet, not as a warning. She threw it at Caleb Voss with every ounce of force her arms and shoulders and 16 years of hauling wood and water and supply crates and fighting the Blackstone Mountains every single winter could generate, which turned out to be considerably more than Caleb Voss was prepared for. The bar was 12 inches long and weighed approximately 27 pounds, and it covered 8 feet in a flat, fast arc, and it caught him in the chest and upper stomach with a sound she felt more than heard, dense and final, like a door closing on something that had been open too long. Voss went backward, not stumbling, backward completely, his feet going out from under him and the air leaving his body in a single compressed sound, and he hit the rock shelf edge, and he went over it. Not over the 200-foot drop. The shelf was wider than that at his position, and what he went over was the outer lip of the granite shelf, down the first sharp break of the rock face, 15 feet of loose stone and ice before the terrain leveled briefly. She heard him hit. She heard him stop. The scout stood frozen for 1 full second. Silas shot him in the shoulder, and he sat down hard on the traverse and stayed there. From the tree line, shouting, men starting onto the traverse at once. She could see them coming, 3 in the first wave, and she grabbed the shotgun and fired the first shell into the rock face in front of the lead man. Not at him, in front of him, and the blast and the rock fragments were enough to make all 3 of them pull up short and go flat. "Voss is down," Silas called out to the tree line, loud and deliberate. "Your man on the traverse is hurt. If anyone else comes onto that rock, the next shot doesn't miss." Silence from the tree line. The particular silence of men without clear leadership making rapid individual calculations. Eleanor ejected the spent shell and loaded the last one with hands that were working on memory because she couldn't feel her fingers properly anymore. She looked at Silas. He was watching the tree line. His face was stone. "How long do we hold?" she said, low. "Until they decide it's not worth it." "What if they decide it is?" "Then we find out what 17 rounds actually buys us." The wait was 4 minutes, which felt considerably longer. She watched the tree line and the traverse, and she watched the place where Voss had gone over the edge, where nothing moved now. The snow came down with the absolute indifference of weather, coating the traverse and the rock shelf and the still form of the scout who had sat down and not gotten back up. Then from the trees, the sound of horses. Multiple horses, moving, not toward the traverse, away from it, back down the slope the way they'd come. Silas kept the rifle up for another full minute after the sound faded. Then, slowly, he lowered it. Eleanor let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding for some time. "They're gone," he said. For now, he agreed. He looked at the traverse, at the scout, at the edge where Voss had gone over. Then he looked at Eleanor with an expression that was complicated and tired, and something else she didn't try to read immediately. "You threw a 27-pound gold bar at a man." "I did." "From 8 feet. It was closer to 8.5, I think." He stared at her. "Eleanor, I had it positioned. I've been lifting things that weight for 15 years. She set the shotgun down and flexed her hands, trying to push feeling back into them. "It worked." "It worked," he agreed, with the specific helplessness of someone who had no useful response to that. He looked at the edge again. "We should check." They crossed to the outer lip of the shelf and looked down the rock face. Voss was 15 feet below, lodged against a rock outcropping that had stopped his fall. He was not moving in the way a person moved when they were conscious, but he was moving in the way a person moved when they were breathing. "Alive," Silas said. "Yes." "He'll need help getting off that rock face. His men will have to come back for him." "Then let them come back for him." Eleanor straightened up from the edge. "Let them take him down the mountain and tend to him and explain to Aldrich Crane how they lost 16 bars of gold and a man they couldn't kill." She looked at Silas. "Crane is going to want answers. Voss is going to spend a long time providing them. He's not going to spend that time coming after us." Silas considered this. "You're counting on Crane to be the thing that keeps Voss occupied." "I'm counting on greed to do what greed does," she said, "which is turn on itself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the canvas sacks, at the remaining gold, at the smoke still faintly visible in the valley below, where the sky met the distant tree line. The snow was coming harder now, and the wind had picked up in the way it did in the late morning of Blackstone February, when the temperature dropped another 5 degrees and reminded you that the cold had not finished with you yet. "The Henderson Creek Valley is 4 miles east along the ridge," he said. "There's a trapper's shelter I know, about 2 miles in. It's not much, but it's solid, and it has a stove." "How much food?" "Whoever used it last left some. Could be good, could be bad. Even odds. And from Henderson Creek? The valley road goes south, connects to the main Harrow line about 12 miles down. He paused. It's a long walk in this weather with what we're carrying. Then we'd better start now, she said. She picked up one of the canvas sacks. He picked up the other without discussion, without the small negotiation that a different kind of man might have attempted about whether she should carry it. He just picked it up, the same way he fixed fences and rehung doors and showed up in bad weather, without making it into more than it was. They walked east along the ridge, into the snow, single file where the shelf narrowed and side by side where it widened, and they didn't talk for a while because the wind was in their faces, and talking into cold wind cost energy that neither of them had to spare. After a mile, when the terrain eased and the pines closed in enough to cut the wind, Silas said, "For what it's worth." She waited. "I've been in a few bad situations," he said. He was looking ahead at the trail. "Worse than this, maybe, in some ways. I've had people beside me in those situations who were competent, good under pressure, but—" He stopped, started again. "The way you think. When everything's wrong and there's no good option, and most people would either freeze or run. The way your mind moves through that." He paused. "I've not seen that in a lot of people." Eleanor walked for a moment with that sitting between them. "I've had a lot of practice," she said. "I know. I'm not saying it like it was easy for you." He glanced at her. "I'm saying it like it's something worth knowing about yourself." She didn't have an answer for that. Or she had one, but it required more stillness than she currently had access to, and she filed it away in the place where she put things that needed to be looked at carefully and not quickly. The trapper's shelter was where he said it was, and it was roughly what he'd promised: solid, cold, and containing a partial sack of dried beans and a tin of salt pork that had survived the winter intact. The stove took 20 minutes to coax heat from because the flue was iced up, and Silas worked at it with his injured arm and his cold hands while Eleanor stacked the gold sacks against the back wall and sat down on the bench with her boots off, working, feeling back into her toes. When the stove finally caught and the warmth began to work its way out into the small space, they sat on either side of it with the beans heating in the pot and the wind talking at the roof, and neither of them said anything for a long time. It was the first quiet that had felt like quiet in 2 days. Eleanor sat in it and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of what the last 14 hours had been. The shooting, the cellar, Thomas's letters, the fire, the ridge, the gold bar leaving her hands. She was alive. That was the first thing. She was cold and exhausted, and her shoulders would ache for a week, and she had nothing left to her name except the clothes on her back and half a fortune in stolen gold propped against a shelter wall. But she was alive. And across the stove from her, warming his hands and watching the beans, with the patient attention of a man who had decided where he wanted to be, was Silas Rowan. She looked at him in the firelight for a moment, this young man who had walked into her store in October with coin and no angle, and spent 4 months proving that some things were exactly what they looked like. "Silas," she said. He looked up. "Ask me again," she said. "What you were trying to ask on the ridge." He held her gaze. The fire made small sounds. Outside, the snow came down on the Blackstone Mountains with the total, unhurried commitment of something that had nowhere else to be. "Is there any chance," he said carefully, "that you might be willing to find out what this is?" Eleanor Grayson, who had survived a marriage and a widowhood and a mountain winter and a man named Caleb Voss and her own considerable reluctance, looked at Silas Rowan across a fire in a trapper's shelter in the high Blackstone and said, "Yes." Just that. It was enough. The beans were not good. Eleanor ate them anyway, because the body didn't care about quality when it cared about fuel, and she'd learned a long time ago not to confuse the two. Silas ate his portion without comment, which she appreciated. They sat on either side of the small stove in the trapper's shelter while the wind worked at the roof and the snow came down outside with the patient indifference of something that operated on a time scale that had nothing to do with human problems. The word she'd said, "yes," sat in the shelter between them with a weight that was different from the gold's weight. Heavier in some ways, more complicated. She was aware of it the way you were aware of a door you'd just opened into a room you hadn't been in for a very long time, and the air coming through was neither warm nor cold, just different, and you weren't sure yet what the room contained, but you'd committed to finding out. Silas didn't make a production of it. That was the thing she kept returning to about him, the qualities she'd spent months cataloging without admitting she was doing it. He didn't perform his feelings or require her to perform hers. He said what he meant with the minimum necessary words and then let the thing be what it was, and she found this, after 16 years of a marriage in which nothing was ever quite said directly, in which the truth lived in gaps and silences and things carefully not spoken, she found this almost disorienting in how much she needed it. After they ate, she checked his arm and retied the bandage, which had loosened on the ridge. The cut was clean and had stopped bleeding properly, and would heal without further drama if he didn't do anything reckless with it, which was, she reflected, a significant caveat given the last 24 hours. "You should have stayed in the tunnel," she said, working the linen strip. "You were supposed to be at the exit." "I was at the exit," he said. "Then I heard the shot inside the building, and I came back. I had it handled." "I know." He looked at his arm, at her hands working the binding. "I came back anyway." She tied off the knot with slightly more force than necessary. "That was stupid." "Yes," he agreed, completely without remorse. She looked up at him and found him watching her with that direct level quality that she'd stopped trying to deflect about 3 months ago without quite acknowledging the fact. She held his gaze for a moment and then went back to the knot, because some things were easier to feel when you weren't looking at them directly. "Don't do it again," she said. "Can't promise that," he said. "But I'll try." It was the honest answer. She'd have trusted him less if he'd promised. They slept in shifts that night, 2 hours on, 2 hours watching, because neither of them was convinced that Voss's men had gone far enough, or that the situation had resolved itself cleanly enough for both of them to sleep at once. The shelter was small enough that there wasn't much question of distance. She slept on the bench, and he sat against the wall near the stove and kept it fed. And when it was her turn to watch, she sat in the same spot, and he stretched out on the floor with his coat over him and was unconscious in under 3 minutes, which was the kind of thing a person could only do if they'd spent years learning to sleep in difficult circumstances. She sat in the dark and watched the fire's edge under the stove door and listened to the storm and did not think about Thomas. Exactly. She thought about the letters. She thought about the particular specific grief of finding out that the story you'd been telling yourself about your own life was missing a chapter. Not a small chapter, but a central one. The kind that changed the meaning of everything around it. What she landed on, after a long time of sitting with it in the dark, was this. Thomas Grayson had been a man who was running from something before she ever met him, and she had spent 16 years trying to make herself into something worth running toward. The failure wasn't hers. She'd known this, somewhere in the basement of herself, for years. But knowing something in the basement was different from knowing it in the rooms where you actually lived. Now she knew it in the rooms where she lived. It didn't fix anything, didn't undo the winters or the debt, or the particular loneliness of being married to a man who was always already somewhere else in his mind. But it changed the shape of the thing, and sometimes changing the shape of something was the only way to carry it without it breaking you. She looked at Silas sleeping on the floor of the trapper's shelter, this 27-year-old man who had come into her store with coin and no angle and proceeded, with absolute unhurried certainty, to make himself necessary. Not by demanding to be needed, but simply by showing up and doing the work, and being exactly what he presented himself as being. She thought about what it cost to trust that. She thought about what it cost not to. The storm broke toward morning. They left the Henderson Creek shelter at first light with the canvas sacks, and what remained of the dried beans, and a sky that had gone from white to a pale, watery blue that in the Blackstone meant the cold was absolute, but the day would be clear. The valley road south was under a foot of fresh snow that made the going slow, and Eleanor's legs were registering their sustained objection to 2 days of sustained extraordinary demand. But she was moving, and that was the only standard that mattered. Silas found a set of wagon tracks around mid-morning, recent, pressed into the new snow from the night before, and they followed them south, which was either the Henderson Creek logging outfit making a run to Harrow, or a coincidence they'd take regardless. It turned out to be neither. 3 miles down the valley, they found a freight wagon with a broken rear axle and a driver named Persimmon Webb, who was 60 years old and had been sitting with his mule team since before the storm broke, wrapped in every blanket he owned, with the specific philosophical patience of a man who had decided long ago that most situations resolved themselves if you waited long enough. He looked at the two of them coming down the road with their canvas sacks and their assorted wounds and their general appearance of people who had recently had a worse time than him, and he said, "You look like you need a ride more than I need one right now." "We need to get to Harrow," Eleanor said. "Axel's gone," Webb said. "But the mules are fine, and there's a relay station 4 miles south. Man there has tools. We get there, I can fix the axle, and then I'm going to Harrow anyway." He looked at the sacks. "What are you carrying that's that heavy?" "Merchandise," Eleanor said. Webb looked at her with the eyes of a man who had been in freighting long enough to recognize the face of someone who didn't want to be asked twice. "All right," he said. "Merchandise." They helped him dig out the wagon enough to move it on the good axle, which took an hour and cost Eleanor's shoulders considerably, and then they moved south in careful stages to the relay station, where a man named Hobart fixed the axle with the slow competence of someone who'd done it before and charged a fair price and didn't ask questions, which was exactly the kind of person Eleanor had spent 2 days needing to find. By late afternoon, they were on the main road south toward Harrow. Eleanor sat in the wagon bed with her back against the sideboards and the canvas sacks between her feet and Silas beside her, and she watched the Blackstone Mountains recede behind them in the clear, cold air, the ridgelines sharp against the winter sky. She could not see from this angle the smoke from the trading post. It had been 36 hours. There was nothing left to burn. She watched the mountains until the road curved south and the pines closed in, and they were gone. She didn't feel what she expected to feel. She'd expected something like grief or loss, or at minimum the specific hollow ache of closing something out. What she felt instead was something simpler and harder to name. The sense of a chapter ending, not because it had been completed, but because it had been survived. There was a difference, and it took a particular kind of reckoning to sit with it without dressing it up as more than it was. 14 years. Debt and cold and silence, and the slow, wearing work of being a person alone in a place that was trying, in its impersonal way, to make her into something smaller. She had not become something smaller. That was what she could say with honesty, and it was enough. Silas's shoulder was against hers in the wagon. She didn't move away from it. Harrow in February was not a welcoming town. It was a practical one, which was different. The streets were half-frozen mud under packed snow, the buildings were the color of weathered wood, and the people moved with the compressed efficiency of those accustomed to doing everything that needed doing before the cold made it harder. They arrived at dusk. Webb dropped them at the main freight depot and drove on to his own delivery, and Eleanor and Silas stood in the street with the canvas sacks and assessed the situation with the same quiet practicality they'd applied to every other assessment in the last 3 days. "Bank first," Eleanor said. Silas looked at her. "You're going to the bank." "I have a debt to settle." She adjusted the sack strap on her shoulder. "And I have the means to settle it." The First Territorial Bank of Harrow was still open, barely. The young teller behind the counter was in the process of closing out his drawer when they came through the door and looked up with the expression of a man who had been about to go home and was now not going home. Eleanor set the canvas sack on the counter. She opened the top and let him look. The teller looked. He stopped closing out his drawer. "I need to speak with the manager," she said. The manager's name was Aldous Finch, and he was a man who had sent Eleanor 7 letters over 3 years and had the courtesy, at least, to look somewhat uncomfortable when he recognized her sitting across his desk. He was less uncomfortable when he saw what was in the sack. The conversation that followed was not short and was not simple, because nothing involving a lien on a debt and a payment in gold bars ever was. There were questions about the gold's provenance that Eleanor answered with the steady, level tone of a woman who had decided on her story and would not be rattled from it. It was her late husband's estate, recently recovered from a private cache. She had documentation of the property and the marriage. The debt was hers, and she intended to pay it, and the bank could accept the payment, or she could take her business to the territorial office in the morning and see what they had to say about a bank that refused legitimate settlement. Finch accepted the payment. He accepted it with the expression of a man who had several more questions but was calculating that the answers might complicate his life more than the gold was worth. And so he completed the paperwork and stamped the lien satisfied and gave Eleanor a receipt that she folded into her coat with the deed and her mother's wedding ring. Outside the bank, Silas was waiting on the boardwalk. He'd been waiting outside because she'd asked him to, not because she needed the protection of the privacy, but because she'd needed to walk through that door as herself, on her own 2 feet, and close the account that had been open since Thomas built the trading post with stolen money and left her to service a debt she hadn't known the origin of. She came out onto the boardwalk and the cold hit her face, and she held the receipt in her coat pocket. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He nodded once, then, "There's a hotel on the East End. I passed it coming in last year. It was clean enough." "We need to talk about what comes next," she said. "I know." "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight I need to sleep in a bed." He almost smiled. Not quite. "Fair enough." They walked to the hotel on the East End, which was clean enough, and Eleanor paid for 2 rooms with coin from the emergency supply she'd kept on her person through everything, because losing all your money at once was a different kind of catastrophe than losing your building. She slept for 11 hours without moving and woke to pale morning light coming through a window that faced east. And for the first time in longer than she could specifically remember, she did not wake to a list of things that needed doing before the cold made them impossible. She lay still for a moment and felt the absence of that weight. It was, in its quiet way, the most extraordinary thing that had happened to her in 3 days. Well, they spent 4 days in Harrow, which was what it took to do what needed doing. Silas sent a wire to a Wells Fargo field office in the south, reporting Caleb Voss's location and condition and the circumstances under which he'd ended up on a Blackstone Mountain rock shelf, which was a legally complicated communication that he drafted 3 times before he was satisfied with the version that said what needed to be said without saying more than was advisable. He'd spent 2 years building a case against Voss in his own head, and turning it over to an institution meant surrendering the conclusion, meant trusting that the machinery would do what it was supposed to do rather than doing it himself. Eleanor watched him send the wire from across the telegraph office and saw, in his face, the particular expression of a man releasing something he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing the weight. "Will they act on it?" she asked, walking back to the hotel. "If Voss is where I said he is, and his men brought him down the mountain, and he's still in a condition to be transported, yes." He paused. "There are outstanding warrants. My brother's testimony was never given, but the investigation was open. This closes it." And Aldrich Crane? Crane is a harder problem. He said this with the honesty of someone who had stopped letting himself believe in clean endings. Men like Crane don't get held accountable the same way. But Voss is what Crane used to stay clean. Without Voss, he left it there. "He has to do his own dirty work," she said, "or hire someone new who doesn't know where all the bodies are." He glanced at her. "Either way, we're not in his line of sight. We're 2 people he's never heard of who caused a problem for one of his operations in a remote mountain territory. Crane is going to look at the cost of finding us and compare it to the value of the gold he recovered from the cellar and decide his time is better spent elsewhere." 14 bars, she said. 14 bars, worth about $18,000 at current rate. He paused. "Enough to make it a wash if you're Crane." Eleanor walked with this for a moment. "And the 16 we're carrying are ours," he said. "Thomas stole them. The 2 men he stole them with are dead. The guards they killed have been dead for 20 years with no surviving family on record. I checked before I came north because I wanted to know the shape of what Voss was chasing." He said this carefully, the way he said things he'd thought through. "There's no one alive with a legal claim to that gold except possibly the Sierra Pacific Railroad, which went bankrupt in the Panic of '83 and was absorbed by a holding company that was itself dissolved 6 years later. So there's no one to return it to." There's no one to return it to. She thought about Thomas, about the guards who had died in a mountain pass 20 years ago because her husband had needed money and had decided that need outweighed other people's lives. She thought about this with the same uncomfortable honesty she'd been applying to everything else, and she didn't dress it up. He had done a terrible thing. She had been the unknowing beneficiary of it. Both of those things were true, and they would remain true regardless of what she did with the gold or how she felt about it or how many years she put between herself and the Blackstone Mountains. What you did with a true thing you couldn't change was you decided what kind of person you wanted to be going forward. "I want to do something with part of it," she said. Silas looked at her. "What kind of something?" "The families of those guards. If there are no direct families, then something, a fund, a contribution to something that helps people who are hurt by the kind of thing Thomas did." She paused. "I know it doesn't balance anything, I'm not under the impression that it does, but I want to do it anyway. He was quiet for a moment. I can help you find the right people to set that up. I know you can. She glanced at him. That's why I said it to you instead of to myself. Something in his face settled, the way a thing settled when it found the place it was supposed to be. They left Harrow in the third week of February on a southbound stage that connected to the main western line at a junction town called Reyes Crossing, 3 days' travel in good weather. Eleanor had purchased a coat that fit properly because her old one had been lost in the fire, and the cold didn't care about anything except whether you were adequately prepared for it. Silas had his arm properly looked at by a doctor in Harrow who told him it was healing without infection and would be fully functional in 6 weeks, and charged him $2 for this information, which Silas paid without comment. They sat beside each other on the stage south and talked, sometimes, and were quiet, other times. And Eleanor found that the balance between those two things felt right in a way that she would have had trouble articulating but recognized immediately. Some people you needed to fill every silence with, because the silences otherwise became something uncomfortable. With Silas, the silences were just silences, not empty, not weighted with unspoken things, just two people being in the same place and not requiring anything from each other in that particular moment. She'd forgotten that it was possible. She hadn't known she'd forgotten it until she was sitting in a stagecoach heading south and feeling it. At Reyes Crossing, they took the Western Line, and on the second day of the train ride, Eleanor sat at the window and watched the country change. The mountains behind them first, blue-white in the distance and then lost in haze. Then the high desert, tawny and enormous and indifferent. Then, gradually, as they moved south and west, the color changing, greener, softer, the sky a different blue, the air that came through the window gap carrying something that wasn't cold. "I've never seen the ocean," she said. This was not a statement she'd planned to make. It arrived the way things arrived when you'd been quiet enough for long enough that your mind stopped editing itself. Silas looked up from the window on his side. "I have," he said. "Once, coming up the coast when I was 19. What's it like?" He thought about it. Not the performative thinking of someone buying time, but actually considering it. "Like the mountains," he said, "but moving. And you can't see what's in it, which is either frightening or a relief depending on your temperament." "Which was it for you?" "Relief," he said. "The idea that there's something that large that doesn't require anything from you." He paused. "The mountains always felt like they were testing me. The ocean just was." Eleanor turned back to the window and watched the country moving past. "I think I'd like to see it," she said. "Then we will," he said, as simply as that. It was not a promise about the ocean specifically. They both knew that. It was a statement about the shape of what they were doing, that they were doing it together, and that the future it pointed toward was one they were building as they moved through it, rather than one that had been decided in advance. Eleanor had spent too long in a life where the decisions had already been made, where the shape of each day was determined by debt and season and the particular inflexibility of the situation she was in. The idea of a future that was genuinely open was something she approached carefully, the way you approached anything that had hurt you before, not refusing it, but not pretending the caution wasn't there either. She was 43 years old. She had silver at her temples and rough hands and a specific, hard-won knowledge of what she could endure and what it cost to endure it. She was not the woman she'd been at 27 when she followed Thomas Grayson to the Blackstone Mountains and believed that the life taking shape around her was the one she'd chosen. She was not going to become that woman again. What she was going to become was something she didn't fully know yet. That uncertainty was, she was slowly and carefully deciding, not a problem to be solved. They arrived in a coastal territory town called Marin's Point in the first week of March, which was earlier in the year than Eleanor had intended to arrive anywhere, but which was where the train went and which turned out, against reasonable expectation, to be the right place. Marin's Point sat on a bluff above the Pacific. It was small, maybe 300 people, and had the rough-edged character of a town still deciding what it wanted to be. There was a harbor with fishing boats and a small freight operation and a main street with a general store and a land office and a saloon and a church, and the beginning structures of what someone clearly hoped would become more. They stayed at the boarding house while they looked at land, which took 2 weeks because Eleanor was not going to make a decision about land quickly just because she had the money to make it. She walked every parcel they were shown twice, in different weather, at different times of day, the way she'd have assessed any piece of ground that was going to require her sustained investment and trust. The property they settled on was 120 acres on the inland side of the bluff, sheltered from the worst of the sea wind, with soil that the land agent said was good for grazing, and a creek that ran dependably from a spring higher on the ridge. There was an existing structure, a two-room cabin, nothing like adequate, and a barn that needed the roof replaced but was otherwise solid. Eleanor stood in the middle of the property on a clear March afternoon and looked at the cabin and the barn and the 120 acres and the creek and the sky. "It's not much," the land agent said with the nervous honesty of someone who genuinely wasn't sure of the sale. "I know what it is," Eleanor said. She bought it. The first year was hard in the ways that first years on new land were always hard, which was to say it was hard in practical, manageable, familiar ways that Eleanor knew how to meet. The cabin needed work before it was livable for two people with any degree of comfort. The barn roof took 3 weeks to replace and cost more than anticipated because the timber in Marin's Point was priced for people who hadn't grown up where trees were. The grazing operation started with 12 head, and the constant low-grade anxiety of someone who knew that 12 head was not enough, but was what they could support through the first season while they got the land right. Silas worked the property with the same focused competence he'd applied to everything else. Without performance, without requiring acknowledgement, just doing the work that needed doing. He was good with the animals, in the particular way of someone who had spent years alone in territory where the animals were the only company, and the cattle responded to this, which Eleanor noticed and appreciated in the practical way she appreciated things that made the operation work. He was also, she discovered over the months, genuinely funny when he was comfortable. It came out in dry observations made without emphasis, in the particular timing of something he'd say exactly when the situation was at its most absurd. And it caught her off guard the first several times in a way that she found she liked. The surprise of it, the evidence that there were rooms in this person she hadn't seen yet. They were married in September, in the Marin's Point land office, which was the most practical venue available, and neither of them felt any need for more ceremony than that. The land agent who had sold them the property witnessed it along with his wife, who cried in the specific way that some people cried at weddings. Not sadly, but at the evidence of something surviving against odds. Eleanor wore the dress she'd bought in Harrow in February, which was serviceable in blue and not in any particular way a wedding dress, and she thought about this and decided that wearing it anyway was the honest choice, because she was not going to dress the thing in something it wasn't. She was a 43-year-old woman marrying a 27-year-old man in a land office in a small coastal town, and they were both going into it clear-eyed about what it was and wasn't. And that clarity was what she trusted more than anything else about it. Silas held her hand during the brief words that were said, and his hand was warm and steadier than hers. And when it was done, he looked at her the same way he'd always looked at her, directly, without performance, like she was simply the person he had chosen, and the choosing was not complicated. People in Marin's Point talked, of course. People in small towns always talked. The 16-year age difference was the kind of thing that generated opinions in the way a dropped stone generated ripples, automatically and without requiring anything from the stone. She heard comments that reached her indirectly, the way comments in small towns did, filtered through neighbors and shopkeepers and the woman at the general store, who was not unkind but was thorough about conveying information. She had expected this and was not surprised by it. What surprised her slightly was how little she cared. Not in the aggressive way of someone who had decided not to care as a defense, simply in the way of a person who had learned, through considerable difficulty, the difference between what other people thought about her life and what her life actually was. They were two different things, and she had spent too many years confusing them, and she was done with that particular confusion. Silas, for his part, met comments about his marriage with the same level non-response he met most things. Someone at the saloon once made a remark, she heard about it secondhand, about whether he'd married his mother. Silas had apparently looked at the man for a moment and then said, "You think about my mother a lot?" and turned back to his drink, and the remark had not been repeated. The operation grew. By the third year, they had 60 head and a reputation for reliable stock, and Eleanor had added a supply component to their operation. Basic goods sold to the fishing boats and the smaller ranches north of town, nothing like the old trading post in scale, but enough to keep her hands in what she knew. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The difference was that now the money it made was hers clearly and completely, with no debt running in the other direction and no ghost in the foundation. She thought about Thomas sometimes, less than she expected to. When she did, it was without the old tangle of guilt and inadequacy, without the weight of the question she'd been carrying for 8 years about whether she had been enough. That question had been answered in a cellar in the Blackstone Mountains in February by letters in her dead husband's handwriting. The answer was not comfortable, but it was clean, and she had found, over time, that she preferred a clean, uncomfortable answer to a comfortable, ambiguous one. She had been enough. The failure of that marriage had never been hers to carry. She had carried it anyway, for years, because that was what happened when you lived inside a lie long enough without knowing it was one. She let it go. Not all at once, not cleanly, not in one deliberate act of release that resolved everything neatly. Piece by piece, over months and then years, the way you let go of most things that had been embedded long enough to leave marks. Some mornings she still felt the old weight, briefly, before the day began, and she remembered where she was and who she was now. Then she got up and made coffee and went out to the morning and lived in it, which was the only thing she'd ever found that actually worked. Silas's arm healed fully, as the Harrow doctor had predicted. He took a part-time role tracking for a survey outfit that was mapping the coastal territory, which meant he was gone 2 or 3 weeks at a time in the spring and fall, and home the rest of the year. She had not asked him to give up that work. He had not offered to. They had simply understood, without negotiating it explicitly, that she was a person who needed room, and he was a person who needed movement, and that these two needs were not incompatible if you didn't try to make them into something they weren't. When he came back from those trips, he came back to the property and to her. And he always came back. That, she had decided, was the thing. Not the grand gestures or the perfect understanding or the seamless synchrony that people talked about when they talked about good marriages. The fact of coming back. The fact of choosing the same thing twice and then again. 4 years after they arrived in Marin's Point, a woman named Delia Marsh, who ran the town's small newspaper, asked Eleanor if she would write a monthly account of the operation's agricultural practices for the paper's readership, most of whom were trying to figure out how to make the coastal land work. Eleanor agreed and wrote the column for 3 years, during which time she discovered that she was good at explaining things. The specific, practical knowledge of how to keep animals through a hard season, how to read the weather coming off the water, how to manage a small operation with limited capital and maximum attention. People wrote to the paper about the column. A few came to the property to see the operation in person. Eleanor showed them what she knew without fuss or performance, the way she'd always done things, and a few of them started operations of their own that did well, and some of them came back to tell her so, and she took this in the quiet way she took most good things, without disbelieving it, without making it smaller than it was, and without needing it to be larger. The woman that Harrow and the Blackstone Mountains and Thomas Grayson's lies and 8 years of silence had tried to make into someone who had already used up her best years was at 47, at 50, something different, not unrecognizable, not magically transformed, just more fully herself than she'd ever been permitted to be before. The rough edges intact, the hard knowledge intact, the capacity for warmth that she'd always had but had learned not to spend carelessly, now spent on things that were worth it. Silas, on a spring evening in their 5th year, came in from checking the fence line on the north pasture and found her at the kitchen table with the old tin box open in front of her, the one from the trading post, her mother's wedding ring inside it, the thing she'd taken when she'd left everything else. He sat down across from her and looked at the box. "You kept it," he said. "I always kept it." He looked at the ring inside. "Your mother's? She gave it to me when I left home to marry Thomas." Eleanor looked at it. "She said it would keep me safe. I don't know that it did that, but I kept it." Silas reached across the table and closed the tin gently. He didn't say anything, which was right. "I'm glad I kept it," she said. He looked at her across the table in the late light coming through the kitchen window. This man who was now 31 years old and who had gray starting at his own temples from years of outdoor living, and who was still, after all this time, the most straightforward person she had ever known. "I'm glad you kept it too," he said. Outside, the Pacific was doing what it always did. Moving, enormous, not requiring anything. Eleanor had seen it now, many times. Silas had been right about it. It was like the mountains but moving, and you couldn't see what was in it, and she had decided in her particular way that this was not frightening at all. Some things were allowed to be large and unknown. Some things were allowed to be exactly what they were without requiring you to understand them completely. She had learned this late. She had learned it anyway. That was the thing about time. People talked about it as though it were a thief, the years going, the chances narrowing, the window of possibility closing in increments until there was nothing left but the life you'd already had. Eleanor Grayson. Rowan, who had stood in a frozen trading post at 43 and told a young man he was too late, had discovered that this was not how time worked. Time was not a thief. It was a terrain. Difficult in places, brutal in others, occasionally so beautiful it stopped your breath. You moved through it as yourself, or you didn't move honestly at all, and the only things that actually ran out were the things you refused to reach for. She had been afraid for a long time. She was not afraid now. Not of the years behind her, not of the ones ahead, not of this quiet kitchen, this man across the table, this life that had not come from anywhere she expected and had turned out, in its imperfect and unfinished and ongoing way, to be exactly enough.
Ben? Ben? Okay. Ben? Ben? You okay, Ben? Everything? I don't think he's done. What was that? What am I hearing? Is Ben dead? My spidey senses are tingling. Is Ben alive?
I don't know, it keeps going in and out of no signal, so I'm assuming he's alive.
I don't think he is. That looks dead to me. I think his head got blown off. Wait. Oh, fuck. Stop switching between people. I'm trying to get Ben. I'm pretty sure the ghost got him. Nope, something else got him. I think we've got enough money. Let's just get out.